I saw the launch. Lived in Tampa, Florida, stood in my front yard, watched the launch of Apollo 11, and then sometime later, I was in the stands for the launch of Apollo 13, the one that had the difficulty. So those are very exciting days. Now, why am I mentioning that? Well, a number of very fine, credentialed aerospace engineers are creationists. Now, NASA itself, NASA per se, is not a creation organization. In fact, it's quite atheistic. I've lectured twice at NASA. They are interested in the biosphere. I hold 3 patents on the biosphere that's on the other side of the building. We're in the process of getting the large one online. For a decade, we had the small one online. We ran experiments. And what we were doing was experimenting with a simulation of the pre-flood world. We do know 8 parameters that were different in the pre-flood world, and each of those synergistically contributes to making it a wonderful place to live. Now, I just 3 weeks ago released the book, Crystal and Canopy. It's at the back. Full color, hardbound. 40 years of research on the pre-flood world. Some of you are proficient in mathematics. There's a lot of math in it, but you can skip that if you want to. Sir David Otway Ray heard a telecast that I made, an international telecast, and he watched it, contacted me. He was knighted by the Queen of England for his work in astrophysics and math, a member of 5 academies of science in the Eastern Bloc countries simultaneously. So he contacted me and he said, I just saw you giving a lecture on the creation model, what the world was like before we tore it up in the flood. And it's a result of our activity. God's judgment, rightful judgment, by the way. So he said, I can finish your model. I can complete it. And he did. But David Ray was so intelligent, he had difficulty talking. And he worked in the advanced physics departments. And when I have locked away in safety deposit the original papers that he wrote giving the pre-flood model, substantiating the canopy suspension in the pre-flood model. But he was a specialist in quantum algebra. But I couldn't publish that because nobody would understand it. So it took decades to then meet David Bassett, who's at the back, who's a math teacher, and then to meet Professor Edward Boudreau, a physical chemist. And he was able, for the first time in history, to show that a thin, like 2 centimeter thick, 2 centimeters or about 2/3 of an inch, about like that. 2 centimeter thick crystalline canopy could be held in suspension with the conditions, the electromagnetic conditions before the flood of Noah's day, the strength of the magnetic field, etc. So all of that is in the book, but also in the book are colored charts and graphs describing 8 candidates for the suspension canopy. It's a scientific exercise, and 8 different parameters that we know to have been different before the flood. Now, the 50th anniversary, why am I talking about the moon landing? Well, first of all, I'm very interested in it. I remember where I was when John Glenn was orbiting the Earth. Later, I met the pad foreman, in fact, who became a very personal friend, the pad foreman who launched John Glenn, Alan Shepard, Wally Schirra, Gus Grissom, Neil Armstrong in the Gemini programs, et cetera, et cetera. But more than that, what they found when they got to the moon, even though NASA will not have the right slant to it, the space program has been of great interest. But I want to tell you 2 things they discovered. Part of them had to do with that radioisotopic heater because it powered a number of the instruments, but particularly the first instruments placed on the moon. Neil Armstrong made the first step, took the first step. Buzz Aldrin placed the first instrument on the moon. That was a seismograph or a seismometer, depending on how you approach it. It was to measure the moonquakes, and it was powered by Richard Grove's radioisotopic heater. If you Google moon instruments, seismograph, you'll see a sketch, a photo, or a sketch of the seismograph. If it's a sketch, if it's a diagram, you will see an arrow pointing to a little round cylinder, and it'll say isotopic heater. And that's what he designed and placed there. Anyhow, that first instrument not only was a seismograph, but it had panels that monitored the rate of cosmic dust settling on the moon. Now, Bill Overn, who has been to this museum when we were just a little double-wide mobile unit, that's been a few years ago. Bill Overn, aerospace engineer, was assigned the task of building those big dishes, those pods on the bottom of the lunar lander legs. You see, the evolutionary community knew the moon was 4.4 billion years old and the Earth was 4.6 billion years old. Everybody knows the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and everybody knows the moon is 4.4 billion years old, right? So anyhow, they wanted to understand, wanted to monitor the rate. So they estimated the rate at which cosmic dust was coming in from outer space and settling on the moon, given its gravitational attraction, giving a larger gravitational attraction next door. You still with me? The Earth would pull in more. We have 50,000 tons annually, cosmic dust, coming in on the Earth. Factoring all of that in, the rate of moon dust settling. So everybody knew the moon was 4.4 billion years old. So given estimating the rate at which cosmic dust was settling in, that would mean that these astronauts settling on the moon, landing on the moon, would be landing into a sea of unconsolidated cosmic dust. That's the reason for those huge pods, dishes, concave dishes. There were 4 of them. Bill Overn, who was a personal friend of mine, he's now home in glory. Bill Overn helped design those. He was commissioned to head the committee. And he said, you're not going to need them because the moon's not that old. They said, certainly, everybody knows the moon is how old? 4.4 billion. So sure, we're going to design them. So he's okay. So he designed them. Well, as you know, when they landed on the Sea of Tranquility, they were going to land in a crevasse, a huge ditch with huge boulders. So Neil Armstrong, who was an incredible pilot, took manual control. They had 19 seconds of fuel left. Did you know that? There were 19 seconds from absolute disaster. Or to land in there, in that crater, would have been disaster with the huge boulders. What's going to happen? They only had 1 thruster to get out. Did you know that? The moon lander only had 1 thruster engine to get out. So he took manual control, moved it over, set it down, and he said, Houston, the Eagle has landed. And they were pleased. We all were pleased. But they saw very little dust. So later, 1 small step for a man, 1 giant leap for mankind. And he stepped down, and a few moments later, he said it's only about 1/8 of an inch thick. How correct was he? Because of the instrument to power our other instruments on the moon, collection of solar panels. Recently, Dr. Brian O'Brien, who was with Rice at that time, Rice University in Houston, went back to Australia. He's a physicist at Western Australia University. Found his backup tapes. And they were able now to calculate, just recently, to calculate the rate at which cosmic dust settles on the moon. And it turns out to be much more rapid than they thought. It settles at, their calculations show, settles at the following: 1 millimeter per millennium, per 1,000 years. A millimeter, David Bassett, help me out. Oh, good, good. Now, you multiply 1 millennium, which is 1,000 years, back to the time of the flood when this whole thing got disrupted. In case you want to take notes, 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18 describe the activity on earth that actually sent out waves and sound and energy into the heavens at the time of the flood, when the flood was initiated. The only safe place on earth was inside a boat. 4,400 years. Okay, so you multiply the time and the accretion of the dust, which is 0.04 inches. He said it was 1/8 of an inch. You multiply roughly 4,500 years ago.
Too close.
He was wrong. It's not 1/8, it's 1/5 of an inch. So he was spot on. The moon is young. So you won't find NASA teaching that. But it wasn't until recently that they found the backup tapes and were able to actually calibrate with other instruments. And here we have, the moon is very young, but that's not all. Another discovery they made, and I think it's worth our time to consider this at the 50th anniversary. They collected, I think, like 47 pounds of rock, something like that, altogether quite a few hundred pounds with all of the NASA flights. But about 45 pounds of rocks between them. And as they were getting ready, Neil Armstrong was the first to step down, the last to step off the moon. He was the commander. As they were getting ready to get it back in the lunar lander and to blast off back to the command module, he saw that these rocks just might shift around a bit and they were going to have to go through some gyrations to get back to Earth and splash down. So he took a scoop and took 9 scoops of lunar soil dust. The soil. 9 of them, not the dust, but the soil. 9 of them, and that did what he needed to be done. That turned out to be one of the most adventurous and most beneficial experiments in space science, because when they were finally analyzed, they found that pulverized in the moon dirt among the other rocks, which were, some of them were breccia. Breccia is a conglomeration of various elements. Lava and basalt. Intermixed in all of that were tiny little grains of anorthosite. Now that's very, very important. You still awake? Everybody still awake? Anorthosite. We have some anorthosite on planet Earth. It's in the feldspar in granite. It's designed to be there. But we only have a bit of it. But they were able to project the calculations from all of the moon landings, the ratio of anorthosite. It is a crystalline, it is a white crystalline matrix, a rock. It is less dense than the breccia around it, the other rock fragments, and the basalt and the lava. So you've got a phenomenon. It's like, is ice water? Sure it is. It's in a different state. So if you have a glass of water and you take a little piece of ice, well, the ice is water. You push it to the bottom, pull your finger out, what's going to happen to it? It's going to float. Well, it's the very same substance. It's just of a different specific density and specific gravity. So it's going to float. Same thing on the moon. That means that anorthite, if you have enough of it, and now they've calculated, and you can Google NASA and anorthite, and it'll show you a diagram as they envision the moon. In the past, the entire surface of the moon, before the contamination of breccia, lava, and basalt, still with me? The entire surface of the moon, even the secularists admit, was covered with anorthite. The entire surface. And why am I talking about that? Well, the scripture says in Genesis 1:16, God made two great lights. The greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. Does the moon really rule the night? Well, it's romantic, it's pretty. It affects our lives. As it affects the oceans in our bodies. But it doesn't really rule the night at this moment. However, if you took all the contamination out of the anorthosite, covered the entire surface of the moon, how much brighter? David Bassett, how much brighter would the moon have been under those pre-flood conditions than today?
The scientists who write for the Creation Research Society quarterly, and they said it could be from 2 to as much as 10 times brighter. But I think the average is around 7 times brighter.
Around 7 times. Creation scientists have calculations to show. Wow! So the moon would rule the night under those conditions. But one other little caveat that I need to mention, then we'll get to the regular lesson. The specific structure of anorthite is such that when the sun strikes it, it of course reflects the rays of the sun. You and I are not the light, we simply are here to reflect the light. And thus, as reflectors, we become the light of the world. But he is really the light, just as the sun is the dominant factor and the moon reflects the light. Not only does something happen when you strike a crystal with energy. You know what the piezoelectric effect is? You take a crystal and you either strike it or radiate it or press it, and it gives off electricity. It gives off a signal. Well, it also can give off an acoustical signal. Watch closely. Anorthite, when energized by the rays of the sun, if it is pure, gives off an acoustical signal that you can barely hear but can be detected. 528 hertz. Now that's amazing because our DNA is being damaged. How many knew we have damaged DNA? We're damaged merchandise. Our DNA is being damaged every day, more and more and more. But the Creator placed within the structure of the cell what's called excision repair. Harvard produced an amazing diagram of the enzyme that walks up and down the spine of our DNA. An enzyme, it has 2 feet on it. Wow. It steps, grabs, takes another step, takes another, it walks up and down the DNA backbone. Did you know that? It's astounding. What it's doing is finding errors and repairing them. It is triggered into action, into activity, by 528 hertz. So in the world before the flood, the moon in its phases, starting dark, new moon, bright, apex, crescendo, and then decline over a period of weeks. There's a period of time when there's no light of the moon visible at all. That activity would have actually triggered the repair of the mistakes on our DNA to the degree that it could. but we're making so many mistakes, we don't have enough erasers to get rid of them. Did you get all that idea? So the moon is a major consequence. And it was that step by Neil Armstrong, 9 scoops of dirt, and in that they found the anorthite.